the world of shinobi, there are many acts that are considered unforgivable, but few carry the weight of what Itachi Uchiha chose to do. A single night, a single decision, an entire clan erased. Not in battle, not in self-defense, not in the chaos of war where lines blur and responsibility becomes difficult to assign, but deliberately, systematically, quietly. The Uchiha clan, one of the founding pillars of the Hidden Leaf Village, was wiped out from within, not by an invading force, not by an external enemy, but by one of its own. A prodigy, a child, someone who understood the weight of what he was doing long before he ever carried it out. And no matter how many explanations are offered, no matter how much context is added later, the act itself does not change. It remains what it is. Genocide. There is a kind of stillness in that realization, a refusal of the mind to immediately move forward, because some actions do not invite understanding. They resist it. They sit in place, heavy and unmoving, forcing you to confront them directly rather than interpret them. And this is where the story of Itachi must begin. Not with justification, not with sympathy, but with the act itself. Because if this act can be justified, then something deeper begins to shift. Not just in how we see Itachi, but in how we understand the world that made him possible. On that night, there were no grand speeches, no visible hesitation, no dramatic collapse into emotion. There was only precision, movement through familiar streets, through a place that once represented belonging, now reduced to a series of locations that needed to be cleared. Each step was intentional, each action calculated, not chaotic, not uncontrolled, measured. And that may be the most unsettling part of it, because it suggests not a loss of control, but the presence of it. This was not someone overcome by rage or grief. This was not a moment of weakness. This was a decision carried out with clarity, with awareness, with the full understanding of what it meant. And that clarity is what makes it difficult to dismiss. It forces a different kind of question, one that lingers beneath the surface of everything that follows. Why? Not in the sense of curiosity, but in the sense of resistance. Because there are answers that feel insufficient no matter how complete they are. Political tension, imminent rebellion, fear of civil war, orders from those in power. These explanations exist, and they are not false. But when placed next to the reality of what occurred, they begin to feel distant, almost abstract, as if they belong to a different scale of consequence entirely. What does a coup mean when compared to the complete destruction of a clan? What does political instability mean when measured against the eradication of an entire bloodline? These are not equal weights. And yet, this is the exchange that was made. One future removed, another preserved. This is where the discomfort begins to deepen, because the act itself does not exist in isolation. It exists as a response to something else, something larger, something that made such a decision appear necessary to at least one person. But necessity does not erase the act. It does not soften it. It does not transform it into something easier to accept. It simply places it in a different context. And context, while important, does not absolve. It only complicates. Because once you begin to ask why, you are no longer just looking at the act. You are looking at the conditions that made the act possible. And those conditions begin to shift the focus away from the individual and toward the world around him. But that shift is dangerous because it risks creating distance between the action and the responsibility. And there is no distance here. Itachi was there. He made the decision. He carried it out. Every life taken was taken by his hand. And that must remain clear. Because if that clarity is lost too early, the entire argument begins to collapse into something softer than it should be. This is not a story that should feel comfortable. It is not meant to ease into understanding. It is meant to hold tension, to remain unresolved, to sit in that space where judgment feels immediate, but explanation feels incomplete. There is also something else that cannot be ignored. He left one survivor, Sasuke Uchiha, not by accident, not as an oversight, but as a choice. And that choice adds another layer to the act, one that does not make it easier to understand, but more difficult. Because sparing one life among so many does not reduce the weight of what was done. It sharpens it. It suggests intention beyond the act itself. It suggests that this was not simply about ending the clan, but about shaping something that would continue beyond it. A witness, a survivor, a future. And yet, that future was built on hatred, on trauma, on a truth that would not be revealed until much later. Which raises another question, one that does not offer an easy answer. Was this mercy, or was it part of the same decision? Because if Sasuke was spared to carry forward something Itachi could not, then even that act of compassion becomes difficult to separate from the original crime. It becomes part of the same structure, the same plan, the same willingness to sacrifice everything, including how he would be remembered, for something that existed beyond that single night. And that is where the stillness returns. Because before any argument can be made, before any justification can be explored, before any larger perspective can be introduced, there is this moment that cannot be avoided. A brother standing over a fallen clan, a village that continues to exist the next morning, and a world that moves forward as if something necessary had been done. But necessary does not mean right, and right does not mean simple. So the question remains exactly where it began, not softened, not answered, only present. Was this the act of a villain, or the beginning of something far more difficult to accept? It is easy to look at a single act and isolate it, to draw a clear line between right and wrong, between those who destroy and those who protect, and to place Itachi Uchiha firmly on one side of that line. But that clarity begins to dissolve the moment you stop looking at the act itself and begin looking at the world that made such an act possible. Because the shinobi world was never built on innocence, and it was never sustained by morality in the way it often presents itself on the surface. From its earliest foundations, it was a system defined by conflict, shaped by war, and maintained through decisions that rarely aligned with what would be considered just or humane in any ordinary sense. Children were trained as soldiers before they could fully understand what they were being asked to do. Loyalty was enforced not through trust, but through necessity. And entire villages operated under the assumption that survival often required actions that could not be openly acknowledged. Within that system, individuals were not simply raised to become strong. They were conditioned to accept that strength would eventually demand something from them, something that could not be refused without consequence. The idea of sacrifice was not abstract or symbolic. It was real, immediate, and often required at a scale that blurred the line between duty and loss. Shinobi were taught to prioritize the mission above themselves, the village above the individual, stability above truth, and peace above fairness. These were not suggestions. They were expectations, reinforced through training, experience, and the quiet understanding that failure to uphold them could lead to consequences far greater than personal suffering. And when you begin to see the world through that lens, Itachi's decision, while still extreme, no longer appears as something that emerged from nowhere. It begins to feel like something that grew naturally out of the system itself. The Uchiha clan did not exist in isolation from this reality. They were part of the same system, shaped by the same history, and affected by the same tensions that defined the Hidden Leaf Village. Their power made them valuable, but it also made them feared. Their position within the village placed them close enough to influence it, but distant enough to be distrusted. Over time, that distance grew, reinforced by suspicion, surveillance, and a quiet division that neither side fully addressed. What began as caution slowly transformed into resentment, and what might have been resolved through communication became something far more rigid, something that moved steadily toward confrontation. From the perspective of the village leadership, the situation was not simply political, it was existential. A coup from within would not just destabilize the village, it would fracture it entirely, opening the door for external enemies to take advantage of the chaos. The hidden leaf was not operating in a vacuum. Other nations were always watching, always waiting for weakness, always prepared to act if the balance shifted. A civil war would not remain internal for long. It would spread, drawing in other forces, escalating into something far larger than a single conflict between a clan and its village. And within that possibility, there was a fear that outweighed everything else. The fear that the village itself might not survive. But fear, even when justified, does not produce clean solutions. It produces pressure. And that pressure builds until someone is forced to act. This is where the world begins to close in around Itachi. He was not just a member of the Uchiha. He was also deeply embedded within the structure of the village itself, serving as a shinobi who understood both sides of the growing divide. He saw the frustration of his clan, the way they felt pushed to the margins, the way their loyalty was questioned despite their history. But he also saw the fear within the leadership, the calculations being made behind closed doors, the recognition that if the coup moved forward, the consequences would extend far beyond a single night of conflict. This dual awareness placed him in a position that few others could fully comprehend. He was not choosing between right and wrong. He was choosing between outcomes. And both of those outcomes carried a cost. On one side, the Uchiha would rise, attempting to take control of the village, triggering a civil war that could destabilize everything. On the other side, the village would act preemptively, eliminating the threat before it could emerge, preserving stability at the cost of its own people. There was no path that avoided loss. There was no decision that preserved both sides. The system itself had already reached a point where something had to give. And this is where the question begins to shift. Because instead of asking why Itachi did what he did, you begin to ask why no one else did anything before it reached that point. Why the tension was allowed to grow unchecked. Why the divide was not addressed while it was still manageable. Why the system, which depended so heavily on loyalty and unity, allowed one of its own founding clans to reach a state where rebellion felt like the only remaining option. The answer is not simple, because the shinobi world does not operate on simplicity. It operates on compromise, on decisions made in uncertainty, on the constant balancing of risks that cannot be fully eliminated. Leaders hesitate because they understand the weight of their choices. Clans resist because they feel the pressure of being marginalized. And in between those forces, situations develop that no longer have clean solutions, only outcomes that must be chosen despite their consequences. Itachi did not create that situation. He inherited it. And when the moment came, when the tension reached its breaking point, when the possibility of conflict became unavoidable, he was placed in a position where inaction was no longer neutral. Choosing to do nothing would not preserve peace. It would allow events to unfold in a way that could lead to something far worse. something that would not be contained to a single clan or a single village. This does not justify what he did, but it changes the way you see it. Because instead of a single act of cruelty, it begins to look like the final step in a chain of decisions, tensions, and failures that extended far beyond one individual. A system that created conditions where such a choice could exist, and where someone would eventually have to make it. And when that moment arrived, it was not the system that acted. It was him. There is a moment in every conflict where it stops being something that can be resolved and becomes something that can only be survived. In the case of the Uchiha clan, that moment did not arrive suddenly, and it did not announce itself with clarity. It formed slowly, through years of quiet separation, through decisions made in caution that gradually hardened into distrust, and through a pattern of distance that neither side fully corrected until it had already become something irreversible. By the time the idea of a coup began to take shape, it was not simply an act of rebellion. It was the final expression of a tension that had been building long before anyone openly acknowledged it. From the outside, the concept of a coup can feel abstract, like a political maneuver or a strategic attempt to gain power. But within the structure of the Hidden Leaf Village, it meant something far more dangerous. This was not a distant government being challenged by an opposing force. This was a fracture within the very foundation of the village itself, a conflict that would unfold not between strangers, but between individuals who had once fought alongside each other, who shared the same history, the same training, the same understanding of what it meant to protect the village. A civil war in this context would not be contained. It would not be clean. It would be immediate, chaotic, and devastating in a way that would leave no part of the village untouched. And more importantly, it would not remain internal for long. The shinobi world was never static. Every village existed within a fragile balance of power, where strength was constantly measured and weakness was constantly observed. The moment the Hidden Leaf showed signs of internal collapse, other nations would take notice, and they would not hesitate to act. What began as a conflict between the Uchiha and the village would quickly expand, drawing in external forces, escalating into a larger war that would extend far beyond the original issue. In that scenario, the consequences would no longer be limited to one clan or one decision. Entire regions could be destabilized. Alliances could shift. The balance that maintained relative peace could break completely. This is what the leadership of the village feared. Not just rebellion, but collapse. And from their perspective, that fear was not unfounded. But fear does not create resolution. It creates urgency. And urgency narrows the range of acceptable choices until only the most extreme options remain. This is where the situation becomes difficult to separate into right and wrong. Because by the time the coup was fully realized as a possibility, the system had already failed in a more fundamental way. The opportunity for peaceful resolution had passed, not because it was impossible, but because it had not been pursued when it still could have been. What remained were two forces moving toward conflict, each convinced that their actions were necessary, each operating under the belief that the alternative would lead to something worse. The Uchiha believed they had been pushed to the edge, that their position within the village had been reduced to suspicion and control, that their influence had been quietly removed, while their loyalty continued to be questioned. From their perspective, the coup was not simply about power. It was about reclaiming a place they believed had been taken from them. It was a reaction to years of marginalization, a decision shaped by the feeling that they no longer had a voice within the system they had helped build. The village leadership, on the other hand, saw something entirely different. They saw a threat that could not be allowed to unfold. They saw the potential for internal destruction, for a conflict that would weaken the village beyond repair, for a scenario where even victory would come at a cost too high to recover from. And within that perspective, the idea of allowing the coup to proceed became unthinkable. It was not a risk they believed they could take, not a situation they believed they could control once it began. Between these two positions, there was no longer space for compromise, because compromise requires trust, and trust had already been lost. This is the point where return was no longer possible, not because no one wanted peace, but because the conditions that allow peace to exist, communication, understanding, mutual belief in resolution, had already broken down. What remained were decisions made under pressure, calculations based on outcomes rather than principles, and a narrowing path that led toward a single, unavoidable truth. Something was going to happen, and whatever happened would carry consequences that could not be undone. This is where Itachi Uchiha stood, not as an observer, but as someone positioned directly within both sides of the conflict. He understood the intentions of his clan, the weight of their frustration, the inevitability of their decision if nothing changed. But he also understood the perspective of the village, the fear of collapse, the calculation that a civil war would lead to something far worse than the loss of a single clan. He was not choosing between action and inaction. He was choosing between outcomes that had already begun to unfold. And this is where the question becomes more unsettling. Because if the coup had happened, if the conflict had been allowed to play out, if the village had fractured from within and drawn the rest of the world into war, what would the result have been? Would the loss have been greater? Would the destruction have extended beyond the Uchiha to include countless others? Would the system have survived at all? There is no way to answer these questions with certainty, but they exist, and they matter, because they form the context in which the final decision was made. By the time the night of the massacre arrived, it was no longer a matter of preventing conflict entirely. It was a matter of controlling how that conflict would unfold, of limiting its scale, of choosing a path that, while extreme, would prevent something that might be even more destructive. This does not make the decision right. It does not remove the weight of what was done, but it reframes it as something other than a simple act of cruelty. It becomes a calculation, a choice made at the edge of collapse. And that is what makes it difficult to dismiss entirely, because it forces you to consider not just what happened, but what might have happened instead. When a system begins to fail, it rarely collapses all at once. Instead, it hesitates. It stalls. It searches for a solution that does not require sacrifice, a path that preserves stability without forcing anyone to bear the full weight of the decision. And in that hesitation, responsibility begins to scatter, spreading across leaders, advisors, and institutions, until no single person fully claims it. This is what happened within the Hidden Leaf as the tension surrounding the Uchiha clan reached its breaking point. Because while everyone understood the severity of the situation, no one was willing to take the step that would define its outcome. The leadership of the village was not unaware. They saw the signs clearly. They understood the implications of a coup, the fragility of their position, the way a single internal conflict could unravel everything they had built. But understanding a problem and acting on it are not the same thing. The weight of the decision paralyzed them, forcing them into a space where every option felt unacceptable. To negotiate risked empowering the Uchiha further. To confront them openly risked triggering the very conflict they were trying to avoid. To do nothing allowed the situation to escalate. Every path carried consequences, and so the system did what systems often do when faced with impossible choices. It delayed. It searched for alternatives. It waited. Figures like Hiruzen Sarutobi, the third Hokage, represented this hesitation more than anyone. He believed in the village not just as a structure, but as an idea, a place where bonds could overcome conflict, where understanding could replace violence, where unity could be restored if given enough time. His instinct was not to eliminate the problem, but to resolve it, to find a way to prevent bloodshed without resorting to it. And under normal circumstances, that instinct might have been enough. But this was not a normal situation. The timeline was collapsing inward. The space for negotiation was shrinking. And while Hiruzen searched for a solution that aligned with his ideals, the reality of the situation continued to move forward without waiting for him. At the same time, there were others within the leadership who saw the situation in a very different way. To them, hesitation was not wisdom. It was weakness. The longer the village delayed, the greater the risk became. The possibility of a coup was not something that could be managed once it began. It had to be prevented entirely, even if the method of prevention carried a cost that could not be openly justified. From this perspective, the problem was not that the decision was too harsh, but that it had not yet been made. And so the responsibility began to shift, quietly, gradually, from the collective to the individual. Because when a system cannot act, it inevitably looks for someone who can. This is where Itachi Uchiha becomes more than just a participant in the situation. He becomes the point where all of these unresolved tensions converge. He is young, but not unaware, loyal, but not blind. He understands the village, but he also understands his clan. He exists between both worlds in a way that no one else does, and that position makes him uniquely capable of seeing the full scope of what is about to happen. But it also isolates him, because seeing both sides does not make the choice easier. It makes it heavier. Unlike the leaders who can debate, delay, and distribute responsibility across councils and conversations, Itachi does not have the same distance. He is close to the outcome, close to the consequences, close to the reality of what each path will lead to. And that proximity removes the illusion that there is still time to avoid making a decision. He can see that the situation is already in motion, that the conflict is no longer hypothetical, that the moment where something must be done is not approaching. It has arrived. And yet, even at this point, the decision is not his by default. He is not required to act. He is not forced into it. There are still other paths available to him, even if they are uncertain. He could align with his clan, stand beside them as they move forward with the coup, accept whatever outcome follows. He could refuse entirely, step away from both sides, allow events to unfold without directly involving himself. He could trust that someone else will intervene, that the system will find a way to resolve the situation before it reaches its most extreme conclusion. These options exist, but each of them carries a form of avoidance. And avoidance, in this context, is not neutral. It is a decision to allow the future to unfold without interference. What makes this moment significant is not that Itachi was the only one who could act, but that he was the only one who chose to accept the full weight of acting. While others hesitated, debated, or distanced themselves from the final step, he moved toward it. Not because it was easy, and not because it aligned with any simple sense of morality, but because it was the only option that allowed him to directly shape the outcome rather than leave it to chance. And that is where the discomfort deepens. Because when a system fails to produce a solution, and an individual steps in to resolve it through an act that the system itself could not openly justify, the question is no longer just about the act. It becomes about responsibility. Who is responsible for what happened? Is it the individual who carried it out, or the system that created a situation where such an action became possible, and perhaps even necessary? there is no clean answer. Because both are true. The system allowed it, but Itachi chose it. And that choice is what separates him from everyone else. Because while others understood the stakes, he accepted them. While others feared the consequences, he carried them. While others searched for a way to avoid the decision, he became the decision. And in doing so, he stepped into a role that no one else was willing to take. Not a hero, not a savior, but something far more difficult to define. The one who acts when no one else will. The one who accepts what others refuse to touch. The one who ensures that the outcome happens, even if it means becoming the reason it does. There is a difference between making a decision and living inside it. The moment itself, the night, the action, the execution, can be understood as a single point in time, a fixed event that can be described, analyzed, and placed within the larger context of the world. But what follows that moment is something far less visible, something that does not end when the act is complete, something that does not fade simply because the outcome has been achieved. For Itachi Uchiha, the massacre was not just a choice he made. It was a reality he would continue to exist within long after it was over. A weight that did not lessen with time, but instead became part of his identity in a way that could never be separated from who he was. To understand that weight, it is not enough to look at the scale of what happened. It is necessary to look at the nature of it. This was not the elimination of enemies. This was not a battle fought under the rules of war, where both sides accept the possibility of death. This was something far more intimate, far more deliberate, and far more irreversible. The Uchiha clan was not an opposing force. It was his family, his history, his entire sense of belonging. Every face was familiar. Every life taken was connected to him in a way that cannot be reduced to strategy or necessity. And that is what makes the act fundamentally different from anything else that exists within the shinobi world. Because even in a world built on violence, there are boundaries. And this crossed all of them. The mind, when faced with something like this, often searches for a way to distance itself from the act, to reframe it in a way that makes it more manageable. It looks for justification, for context, for reasons that can transform the event into something that feels less personal. But there is no distance here. There is no way to reinterpret the act as something abstract. It was direct. It was intentional. It was carried out by someone who understood exactly what he was doing at every step. And that understanding does not disappear afterward. It remains, not as a memory that can be set aside, but as a constant presence, something that exists beneath every action, every thought, every moment that follows. It is not something that can be spoken about openly. It is not something that can be shared or explained without unraveling everything it was meant to protect. It becomes internal, contained, silent. And in that silence, it begins to shape the way a person exists in the world. This is where the idea of sacrifice begins to shift. Because sacrifice is often described as giving something up for a greater good, as a conscious exchange where the value of what is lost is understood in relation to what is gained. But in this case, the sacrifice is not something that ends with the act. It continues. It expands. It transforms into something that cannot be measured in simple terms, because what was given up was not just the clan, not just the relationships, not just the past. It was the ability to exist without that weight. It was the ability to be seen as anything other than what he had done. And that is where the isolation begins. Because once the act is complete, there is no return to normalcy. There is no reintegration into the system as someone who simply fulfilled a mission. There is no recognition, no acknowledgement, no space where the burden can be placed down and examined by others. The role that Itachi assumes is one that requires him to carry everything alone, to exist in a way that ensures the truth remains hidden, that the purpose behind his actions is never revealed in a way that would change how he is perceived. He becomes the villain, not as a consequence, but as a requirement. And that distinction matters because being seen as a villain is not the same as being one. It is a role that must be maintained, a perception that must be reinforced, a reality that must be accepted even when it contradicts everything that led to the decision in the first place. It is not enough for the act to have been carried out. The meaning of the act must also remain unchanged in the eyes of the world. There can be no correction, no clarification, no attempt to reshape the narrative. And so, the weight becomes twofold. There is the weight of what was done, and the weight of how it must be remembered. This is where the idea of strength begins to take on a different meaning. Strength, in the shinobi world, is often associated with power, with skill, with the ability to overcome opponents and survive in a system defined by conflict. But this is not that kind of strength. This is something quieter, something less visible, something that does not manifest in battle, but in endurance, the ability to continue forward without releasing the burden, without allowing it to break the structure of the role that has been chosen. It is a form of control, not over others, but over oneself. And that control is what allows the decision to remain intact, what prevents it from unraveling under the pressure of its own consequences. Because if that control is lost, if the weight becomes too much, if the truth begins to surface in a way that cannot be contained, then everything that the act was meant to prevent begins to come back into question. This is why the act cannot simply be viewed as something that happened. It must be understood as something that continues, a decision that extends beyond the moment it was made, shaping everything that follows, defining every interaction, every choice, every silence. It is not a single event in the past. It is a constant presence in the present, something that cannot be escaped because it has become part of the foundation on which everything else is built. And within that foundation, there is no relief, no resolution, only continuation. The continuation of a life defined by a single night. The continuation of a role that cannot be abandoned. The continuation of a burden that cannot be shared. And perhaps that is where the question begins to change again. Because it is one thing to ask whether the act was right or wrong, but it is something else entirely to ask what it means to live with it, to wake up each day knowing that the world continues because of something that can never be undone, to exist in a reality where the outcome justifies nothing, but the alternative remains unknown, to carry a decision that no one else was willing to make, and to carry it alone. And in that silence, in that continuation, in that quiet endurance of something that cannot be resolved, the act itself begins to take on a different shape, not smaller, not easier, but deeper, because it is no longer just about what was done. It is about what it cost to keep it done. After the night ended, nothing outwardly collapsed. The village still stood. The system continued. The routines of daily life resumed with a kind of quiet efficiency, as if something tragic had occurred, but something contained, something that did not threaten the structure itself. From the outside, it appeared as though a problem had been resolved. A dangerous possibility had been removed. Stability had been preserved. And in many ways, that was true. But what remained unseen was the foundation that stability now rested on. A lie. Not a simple lie, not a temporary misdirection, but a carefully constructed reality that required constant maintenance in order to function. Because the truth of what had happened, the tension, the coup, the decision, the involvement of the village itself, could not exist openly without unraveling everything the act was meant to protect. If the full reality were known, the consequences would not remain in the past. They would spread into the present, reshaping how the village understood itself, how its people understood their leadership, and how trust operated within a system that depended on it. So the truth was removed, and in its place, a different story was allowed to exist. In that story, Itachi Uchiha was not a product of the system, not someone who had acted within the pressure of an impossible situation, not someone who had made a decision tied to the survival of the village. He was something much simpler, a traitor, a murderer, someone who had turned against his own clan for reasons that did not need to be understood. This version of reality was easier to accept. It required less examination. It preserved the image of the village as something fundamentally just, something that had not participated in the destruction of one of its own. It allowed the system to continue without questioning its own role in what had occurred. And most importantly, it ensured that the outcome, the preservation of stability, remained intact without inviting the kind of scrutiny that could destabilize it again. But for that lie to work, it could not exist partially. It had to be complete. And that meant Itachi himself had to become part of it. He could not return to the village as someone who had fulfilled a hidden duty. He could not exist in a space where the truth was quietly acknowledged. He had to disappear from that system entirely, to remove himself in a way that reinforced the narrative rather than contradicted it. And so, he stepped into the role that had been created for him, not as something imposed upon him, but as something he accepted in order to ensure that the structure of the lie remained intact. He became the enemy, not just in name, but in action. Joining the Akatsuki, a group defined by its opposition to the established order, further solidified the image that the village needed to maintain. It was no longer just a story told internally. It was something visible, something reinforced through his presence among those who threatened the balance of the shinobi world. Every action he took, every appearance, every association contributed to the continuation of that narrative. And yet, within that role, there was a contradiction that remained unseen. Because while the world viewed him as a threat, his actions continued to align with the protection of the very place that had labeled him a traitor. His position within the Akatsuki allowed him to observe, to monitor, to intervene in ways that could not be openly attributed to him. He existed within a space where he could influence outcomes without revealing his intentions, where he could act without being recognized for it, where he could continue to protect the village without ever being acknowledged as its protector. This is where the nature of the lie becomes more complex, because it is not just about hiding the truth. It is about replacing it. The version of reality that exists is not simply incomplete. It is structured in a way that ensures it cannot easily be questioned. The idea that Itachi is a traitor becomes the accepted truth, reinforced through time, through repetition, through the absence of any alternative explanation. And the longer that version of reality persists, the more difficult it becomes to imagine that anything else could exist beneath it. Even for those closest to him, even for Sasuke Uchiha. This is where the weight of the lie becomes something more than just a strategic necessity. It becomes personal, because in order for the lie to function completely, it cannot be selective. It cannot exclude certain individuals. It cannot allow fragments of the truth to exist in places where they might disrupt the structure. It must be consistent, even when that consistency creates consequences that extend beyond what was originally intended. Sasuke does not just believe the lie. He lives within it. He builds his identity around it. His understanding of the world, of his past, of his purpose, is shaped by a version of reality that was deliberately constructed to exclude the truth. And in that sense, the lie does not simply preserve the village. It creates a new form of reality for those who exist within it, one that guides their actions, their motivations, and their understanding of everything that has happened. This raises a question that does not have an easy answer. Because if the lie succeeds, if it preserves stability, if it prevents further conflict, if it allows the world to continue without collapsing under the weight of what has been done, then what is it exactly? Is it deception? Or is it a necessary structure? Because in a world like this, where truth can destabilize as much as it can reveal, the line between those two things begins to blur. The idea that truth is always better, always more just, always the correct path forward, becomes less certain when the consequences of that truth are considered in full. And this is where the argument begins to shift again. Because the act itself, the massacre, can be examined, judged, and debated as an event. But the lie that follows it is something different. It is ongoing. It is maintained. It is reinforced through time. It becomes part of the system in a way that continues to shape outcomes long after the original decision has been made. And Itachi exists at the center of that structure, not as someone who benefits from it, but as someone who sustains it. Because as long as the lie holds, the outcome remains intact. As long as he continues to exist as the villain, the truth remains hidden. As long as the world believes in the version of events that was created, the stability that was preserved through that decision continues to exist. And that is the cost of the lie. Not just that it hides the truth, but that it requires someone to live inside it, completely, without recognition, without correction, without ever being allowed to step outside of it and be seen for what they actually are. And so the question becomes quieter, but heavier. If a lie can hold the world together, then what does that make the person who chooses to carry it? If the lie was meant to protect the village, then it also had to do something else. It had to shape the future, because preserving stability was not only about preventing what had already been set in motion. It was about ensuring that nothing similar could rise again. And within that logic, one detail stands out more than any other, something that cannot be dismissed as incidental or accidental. Sasuke Uchiha was left alive, not as a mistake, not as a moment of hesitation, but as a decision made within the same clarity that defined everything else. And that decision changes everything. Because if the goal had been purely to eliminate the threat, then there would have been no reason to to leave a survivor. One life does not balance the loss of many. It does not reduce the risk. It does not simplify the outcome. In fact, it introduces uncertainty, the possibility that something unresolved could grow into something dangerous again. And yet, despite all of that, Sasuke remained, which means his survival was not mercy in the traditional sense. It was intention. And once that becomes clear, the question shifts in a way that is difficult to ignore. What was he meant to become? Because Sasuke was not left untouched by the truth. He was given a version of it, a carefully constructed reality in which Itachi Uchiha was not a protector, not a product of impossible circumstances, but a villain who had destroyed everything for reasons that did not need to be explained. This version of the truth did not leave space for understanding. It did not allow for ambiguity. It was simple, direct, and emotionally absolute. And that simplicity served a purpose. It created hatred, not the kind that fades with time, not the kind that can be reasoned with or redirected, but something deeper, something more focused, something that could grow and sharpen as Sasuke himself grew stronger. Because hatred, in the world of the Uchiha, is not just an emotion. It is power. It is the very thing that awakens their potential, that pushes them beyond their limits, that transforms loss into strength. And Itachi, more than anyone else, understood this. He understood what it meant to shape someone through pain, to create a future defined not by peace, but by conflict directed toward a single point: himself. And so Sasuke's life becomes something more than survival. It becomes a path built on loss, guided by anger, sustained by the need for resolution that can only come through confrontation. Every step he takes, every skill he develops, every decision he makes is influenced by that original moment, by the image of his brother standing at the center of everything that was taken from him. This is not accidental. It is design, because if Sasuke had been allowed to exist without that focus, without that singular purpose, then the future would remain uncertain. His strength might grow, but it would not necessarily be directed. His potential might develop, but it would not necessarily be controlled. And in a world where power carries the risk of destabilization, uncontrolled potential is a threat in itself. But a weapon is different. A weapon has direction. A weapon has purpose. A weapon does not question why it was created. It only fulfills what it was designed to do. And that is what Sasuke becomes. Not immediately, not obviously, but gradually, as the structure of his life begins to take shape around the absence that was left behind. The need to understand becomes the need to avenge. The desire for closure becomes the pursuit of power. And through that transformation, he is guided toward a single, inevitable outcome: a confrontation with Itachi. This is where the idea of sacrifice takes on another layer, one that is even more difficult to accept. Because Itachi did not just sacrifice his clan. He did not just sacrifice his identity, his place in the village, or the way he would be remembered. He also sacrificed his relationship with Sasuke, not only in the moment of the massacre, but in everything that followed. He became the reason for Sasuke's suffering. Deliberately, he allowed himself to be the source of that pain, knowing what it would create, knowing how it would shape Sasuke's life, knowing that it would push him toward a future defined by conflict rather than peace. And in doing so, he ensured that Sasuke would grow stronger, that he would become capable of surviving in a world that does not reward weakness, that he would develop the kind of power that could not be ignored or easily controlled. But at what cost? Because while this path creates strength, it also creates isolation. It separates Sasuke from others, from connections that might have grounded him, from perspectives that might have allowed him to see beyond his own pain. It narrows his world, focusing everything on a single objective, a single person, a single moment that must eventually be resolved. And that narrowing is dangerous, because when a life is built around a single purpose, there is always a risk that once that purpose is fulfilled, there will be nothing left to hold it together. This is the risk Itachi accepts. Not just that Sasuke will suffer, but that Sasuke might become something he cannot control. Because once the path is set, once the hatred has taken root, once the strength begins to grow, the outcome is no longer entirely predictable. Sasuke may become strong enough to survive, but he may also become strong enough to reject everything that led him there. He may not stop at revenge. He may look beyond it, questioning the system, the village, the very structure that made his life what it is. And if that happens, then the decision that was meant to preserve stability may instead create a new form of instability. But Itachi accepts that risk, because the alternative, doing nothing, allowing Sasuke to grow without direction, without purpose, without the strength that comes from confronting loss, carries its own uncertainty. And in a world where uncertainty often leads to destruction, even a flawed path can appear more acceptable than no path at all. So Sasuke moves forward, growing, changing, becoming something shaped by a truth that is not complete. And all the while, Itachi remains in the distance, not as a brother, not as a guide, but as an endpoint, a final obstacle, a necessary confrontation that will eventually define everything that came before it. And in that design, in that quiet shaping of a life through pain, the question becomes harder to ignore. Because if someone is willing to turn their own brother into a weapon, to shape his future through suffering, to become the very thing that drives him forward, then what does that say about the nature of the decision itself? Was this protection? Or was it something closer to control? There is something deeply unsettling about a life that feels like it belongs to you, but was quietly shaped long before you ever realized it. Not through obvious control, not through direct commands or visible constraints, but through something far more subtle. Through the careful placement of pain, of memory, of perspective, until the path ahead begins to feel natural, even inevitable. This is the reality that surrounds Sasuke Uchiha, a reality that appears, on the surface, to be driven by his own will, his own decisions, his own relentless pursuit of strength and understanding. But beneath that surface lies a structure that was carefully constructed by Itachi Uchiha, one that guides him without ever needing to directly control him. Because the most effective form of control is not force, it is belief. Sasuke believes that his path is his own. He believes that every step he takes, every decision he makes, is a reflection of his own agency, his own determination to uncover the truth and avenge what was taken from him. And in a sense, that belief is not entirely false. He does choose. He does act. He does pursue his goals with a level of focus that cannot be dismissed as anything less than genuine. But the direction of that pursuit, the shape of those choices, the emotional foundation that drives him forward, those things were not created in isolation. They were influenced, guided, and in many ways predetermined by the version of reality he was given. A reality built on a single, unshakable truth: that his brother destroyed everything. And that understanding that truth means confronting him. This is where the illusion begins to take form, not as something artificial, but as something internal. Sasuke is not being forced to walk a specific path. He is being led to believe that the path he walks is the only one that exists. And when a person believes that their options are limited to a single direction, choice becomes something that exists in name, but not in substance. He can decide how he trains, who he aligns with, how far he is willing to go. But the destination remains the same. Itachi. Always Itachi. And this is what makes the design so effective and so deeply unsettling, because it removes the need for control while still ensuring the outcome. It allows Sasuke to grow, to develop, to become stronger in ways that feel entirely self-driven, while quietly reinforcing the idea that everything he is becoming is leading him toward a single confrontation. There is no need to interfere, no need to adjust the path, because the path has already been set in motion. But this raises a question that becomes more difficult to ignore the longer you sit with it. If Sasuke's choices are shaped by a truth that is incomplete, are they truly his? Because choice is not just about action. It is about understanding. It is about having access to the full scope of reality and making a decision within it. And when that reality is altered, when key pieces of truth are removed, when the foundation of a person's beliefs is constructed rather than discovered, then the choices that follow are influenced in ways that cannot be easily separated from that original manipulation. This does not mean Sasuke is being controlled in a direct sense, but it does mean he is being guided. And that guidance is intentional. Itachi does not interfere constantly. He does not appear at every moment to adjust the direction of Sasuke's life. Instead, he allows the structure he created to do the work for him, trusting that the pain, the hatred, the need for resolution will continue to push Sasuke forward without additional intervention. And for a long time, that trust proves to be well placed. Sasuke continues to grow stronger. He continues to pursue power. He continues to move toward the confrontation that has been waiting for him since the moment everything was taken away. But growth does not always follow the path that was intended, because the same intensity that drives Sasuke forward also begins to reshape him in ways that cannot be fully predicted. His understanding of the world begins to narrow. His connections to others begin to weaken. And the line between purpose and obsession becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish. The strength he gains is undeniable, but it comes with a cost, one that extends beyond his own suffering and begins to affect the way he interacts with everything around him. And this is where the illusion starts to fracture. Not because Sasuke begins to question it, but because the consequences of it begin to extend beyond what was originally intended. The path that was meant to lead him to a single confrontation begins to influence every aspect of his life, pulling him further away from balance, further away from the possibility of understanding anything beyond his own objective. The world becomes smaller, more focused, more defined by a single purpose that leaves little room for anything else. And within that narrowing, there is a risk. Because when a person is shaped by a single truth, a single goal, a single driving force, they become powerful, but they also become unstable. Their strength is no longer grounded in a broader understanding of the world, but in a specific need that must be fulfilled. And if that need is disrupted, if the foundation of that belief is challenged, if the truth they have built their life around begins to shift, then everything that was built on top of it becomes uncertain. This is the risk Itachi accepts. Not just that Sasuke will suffer, but that Sasuke will change, that he will evolve beyond the structure that was created for him, that he will begin to question the reality he was given, that he will look beyond the image of his brother as a villain and begin to see something else. And if that happens, then the entire design begins to unravel, because the illusion that once guided him can no longer hold. And when an illusion breaks, it does not disappear quietly. It collapses. It forces everything that was hidden to the surface. It reshapes understanding in a way that cannot be undone. So the question becomes heavier, more difficult to avoid, because it no longer rests only on the act of the massacre or the decision that led to it. It rests on everything that followed, on the life that was shaped, on the path that was constructed, on the illusion that was allowed to exist for as long as it was necessary. And in that space, between what is real and what was made to feel real, the line between protection and manipulation begins to blur in a way that cannot be easily separated. Because if someone creates a reality that guides another person's entire life, even if it is done for a greater purpose, even if it leads to strength, even if it preserves something larger than both of them, then what exactly is that? Is it guidance? Or is it control disguised as freedom? There are truths that illuminate the past, and there are truths that dismantle it completely, not by adding clarity, but by replacing the entire structure that once held meaning together. The difference between them is not in how accurate they are, but in what they do to the person who receives them. Because some truths allow you to understand your life more deeply, while others force you to question whether that life was ever truly yours to begin with. For Sasuke Uchiha, the truth about Itachi Uchiha does not arrive as a resolution, and it does not offer peace. Instead, it arrives as a complete inversion of everything he believed, everything he built himself upon, and everything that gave his suffering direction, transforming not only how he sees his brother, but how he understands his own existence in a way that cannot be undone once it has begun. For years, Sasuke's life followed a structure that felt unbreakable, a singular path defined by loss, sustained by hatred, and sharpened by the belief that his brother stood at the center of everything that had been taken from him. And within that structure, every decision he made, every bond he rejected, every ounce of strength he pursued carried a sense of clarity that did not need to be questioned, because it was built on something that felt absolute. Itachi was the villain, the destroyer, the one responsible, and that understanding allowed Sasuke to move forward without hesitation, without doubt, without the need to consider any possibility beyond the one that had already been given to him. But the moment that truth is replaced, not expanded, but replaced, that entire structure does not adapt. It collapses, because what he is given is not a deeper explanation of the same story, but an entirely different reality, one in which the act that defined his life is no longer what it seemed, and the person he hated is no longer who he believed him to be. In this new reality, the massacre is no longer an act of senseless cruelty, but a calculated decision tied to the survival of the village. And the hatred that once felt justified begins to lose its stability, not because it disappears, but because it no longer has a clear direction, no longer has a singular target that can contain it. The emotions remain, the pain remains, the years of isolation and suffering remain, but the meaning behind them begins to shift in a way that is far more difficult to process. Because if Itachi was not the villain, then what does that make everything Sasuke has done in response to him? And more importantly, what does that make Sasuke himself? This is where the truth becomes dangerous, not because it is false, but because it forces a confrontation with something far more complex than anger, something that cannot be resolved through action alone, because action requires certainty, and certainty no longer exists. The path that once felt inevitable now feels uncertain. The purpose that once felt clear now feels unstable. And the identity that was built around that purpose begins to fracture, leaving behind a space where new interpretations must form, but without the foundation that once supported them. And within that space, something begins to emerge that was not part of the original design, something that exists outside of what Itachi intended when he constructed the lie. The anger does not disappear. It shifts, it expands, and it begins to search for a new place to settle. Because anger, especially the kind that has been cultivated over years, does not simply dissolve when its original target is removed. It redirects itself, reshaping in response to the new understanding. And in Sasuke's case, that redirection leads him toward the system itself, toward the hidden leaf village, toward the leadership that made the decision, toward the structure that created the conditions in which his entire life was shaped by something that was never meant to be fully understood. The focus of responsibility changes, not because the act itself is erased, but because the context behind it can no longer be ignored. And in that shift, the question of who is truly responsible becomes far more difficult to answer. Because if the village ordered it, if the system allowed it, if the decision was made to preserve stability at the cost of an entire clan, then the line between protector and destroyer becomes blurred in a way that cannot be easily separated. And this is where the truth reveals its true consequence, because it does not simply expose what happened. It exposes how the world functions, how decisions are made, how stability is maintained, and how individuals can be sacrificed in the process without that sacrifice ever being openly acknowledged. It forces Sasuke to confront not just his brother, but the entire structure that defined his life. And in doing so, it removes the simplicity that once made his path possible, replacing it with a complexity that cannot be resolved through a single act of revenge. This is the outcome that Itachi could not fully control, because while he could shape Sasuke's growth through the lie, he could not determine how Sasuke would respond to the truth once it was revealed. And within that uncertainty lies the greatest flaw in the original decision, not in its execution, but in its long-term consequences. The lie was meant to guide, to contain, to direct, but the truth, once uncovered, does not remain contained. It expands, reshaping everything it touches, creating new paths, new possibilities, new forms of conflict that were never part of the original calculation. And this raises a question that lingers beneath everything that follows, one that does not have a simple answer, because it does not belong to a single moment or a single decision, but to the entire structure that surrounds it. If the truth was always going to surface, if the consequences were always going to extend beyond what could be controlled, if the path that was created could never remain stable forever, then what was the decision really preserving? Because preventing one form of destruction does not guarantee that another will not emerge, and controlling one outcome does not eliminate the possibility of others. And in a world where every action carries consequences that unfold over time, the idea of a perfect solution begins to feel less certain, less complete, less capable of holding everything together in the way it was intended to. What remains is not resolution, but transformation, a shift from one form of conflict into another, a movement from a controlled narrative into an uncontrollable reality. And within that shift, the weight of the original decision does not disappear. It deepens, because it is no longer just about what was done. It is about everything that came from it, and everything that could no longer be contained once the truth was finally allowed to exist. There is a version of peace that feels calm on the surface, stable, unshaken, something that appears to justify everything that came before it simply because it exists, simply because the world did not collapse, simply because life continued. It is the kind of peace that does not ask questions, that does not look too closely at its own foundation, that allows people to move forward without confronting what was required to create it. And in the aftermath of the Uchiha clan massacre, this is the kind of peace that the Hidden Leaf village inherited. A quiet continuation of normalcy that, from the outside, suggested that the worst had been avoided, that a greater conflict had been prevented, that something necessary, however tragic, had been done to ensure the survival of the whole. But peace like this is not absence. It is construction. And like any construction, it depends entirely on what it is built upon. Because when you look closer, when you move past the surface and begin to examine what allows that peace to exist, what holds it in place, what keeps it from unraveling, you begin to see that it is not as stable as it appears. It is not self-sustaining. It is not natural. It is supported by decisions that were never meant to be fully understood, by actions that cannot be openly acknowledged, and by a truth that remains deliberately hidden beneath everything that continues to function above it. This is the peace that Itachi Uchiha created. Or perhaps, more accurately, the peace he preserved. And the distinction matters, because he did not build something new. He ensured that something already fragile did not break completely, even if the method he used to do so introduced a different kind of instability, one that would not reveal itself immediately, but would remain beneath the surface, shaping events in ways that could not be easily predicted. The village did not fall. The coup never happened. The civil war that might have followed did not begin. From a purely structural perspective, the outcome appears successful. But success, in this case, is not simple, because what was avoided is only one part of the equation. What was created must also be considered. A peace built on sacrifice is not inherently flawed, because sacrifice is often necessary in a world defined by conflict. The shinobi system itself depends on this idea, on the belief that individuals must sometimes give up something: safety, comfort, even their lives, for the sake of something larger. This is not new. It is embedded in the very nature of the world. But there is a difference between sacrifice that is shared, understood, and acknowledged, and sacrifice that is hidden, isolated, and carried by a single individual. Itachi's decision falls into the second category, and that is what makes it different, because the burden of what was done does not belong to the village as a whole. It does not belong to the leadership that made the decision. It does not belong to the system that created the conditions. It belongs to him entirely. And this imbalance creates a form of peace that is inherently unstable, not in the sense that it will immediately collapse, but in the sense that it depends on something that cannot be maintained indefinitely without consequence. The truth remains hidden, but it does not disappear. The decision remains effective, but it does not resolve the underlying issues that led to it. The system continues to function, but the flaw within it remains unaddressed. This is the paradox of the peace that was created. It works, but it is incomplete, because while the immediate threat was removed, the conditions that produced that threat were not fully resolved. Distrust, fear, the imbalance of power, the willingness to prioritize stability over transparency, these things did not vanish with the Uchiha. They remained, embedded within the structure of the village, waiting for another moment, another situation, another decision that might bring them back to the surface. And this is where the weight of Itachi's choice becomes even more complex. Because if the peace he preserved is temporary, if the system he protected is still flawed, if the outcome he ensured only delays a larger issue rather than resolving it, then what exactly was achieved? This is not a question that dismisses the importance of what was avoided, because preventing a civil war, preventing the collapse of the village, preventing the escalation into a larger conflict, these things matter. they carry weight. They represent outcomes that could have been far more destructive than what ultimately occurred. But at the same time, they do not erase the cost of what was done to achieve them. They exist alongside it. And that coexistence is what makes the situation so difficult to define. Because if you measure the decision purely by its immediate outcome, it appears effective. If you measure it by its cost, it appears unforgivable. And if you measure it by its long-term consequences, it becomes uncertain. This uncertainty is what lingers beneath the surface of everything that follows, because the peace that was created is not something that can be fully trusted. It is not something that can be assumed to last indefinitely. It is something that exists within a system that has already proven itself capable of reaching a point where such a decision becomes possible. And that means the potential for similar situations remains. And within that potential, there is a quiet question that continues to exist, one that does not demand an immediate answer, but refuses to disappear entirely. If peace requires this, if stability depends on sacrifice of this scale, if the system can only sustain itself through decisions that cannot be openly acknowledged, then what kind of peace is it? Because true peace, if it exists at all, would not need to hide its foundation. It would not need to rely on a lie. It would not need someone to carry its weight alone. But this peace does. And Itachi knew that. He understood that what he was preserving was not perfect. He understood that the system was flawed. He understood that the outcome would not resolve everything, that it would not create a world where such decisions would never be necessary again. And yet, he chose it, not because it was ideal, but because it was the only option that allowed the present to continue. And that is where the question becomes even more difficult to answer. Because if the choice is between an imperfect peace and a catastrophic war, if the only available solution requires a cost that cannot be justified in isolation, if the system itself cannot produce a better alternative, then what does it mean to choose at all? Was this the preservation of peace? Or was it simply the postponement of something inevitable? At the center of everything that happened, beneath the layers of action, consequence, sacrifice, and silence, there is a question that refuses to disappear. A question that does not belong to the past alone, but continues to exist in every interpretation of it, shaping how the entire story is understood. It is not a question about what happened, because that has already been established. It is not a question about who was responsible, because responsibility, in this case, has never belonged to a single place. It is a question about possibility. Was there ever another way? Because if there was, then everything that followed becomes something else entirely. It becomes not a necessity, but a failure, not an unavoidable outcome, but a decision that replaced something better. And if there was not, then the weight of what was done takes on a different meaning. Not lighter, not easier, but more contained within the limits of what was possible at the time. To ask this question properly, it is not enough to look at the final moment, the night of the massacre, the decision itself. It requires stepping back into the time before that moment, into the slow formation of the conflict, into the years where the divide between the Uchiha clan and the village was still forming, still flexible, still capable of being changed before it became something rigid and irreversible. Because alternatives do not disappear all at once. They narrow gradually, shaped by decisions that were made, and more importantly, decisions that were not. The tension between the Uchiha and the hidden leaf did not begin as something extreme. It developed over time, through small actions, through policies that created distance, through suspicion that was never fully addressed, through a lack of communication that allowed misunderstanding to grow into resentment. The relocation of the clan to the outskirts of the village, the surveillance placed upon them, the quiet but persistent implication that they were not fully trusted. These things did not immediately create rebellion, but they laid the foundation for it. And within that foundation, there were moments where something different could have been done. Dialogue could have been pursued more seriously. Trust could have been rebuilt instead of monitored. Inclusion could have replaced isolation. These were possibilities. Not guaranteed solutions, but possibilities. And the fact that they were not fully realized raises the first layer of the question, because it suggests that the path toward the final outcome was not inevitable from the beginning. It became inevitable over time, through a series of choices that limited the range of options until only the most extreme remained. And by the time Itachi Uchiha was placed in the position to act, those earlier possibilities had already faded, replaced by a situation where every remaining option carried a form of destruction. But even then, even at that final stage, the question does not disappear, because Itachi still had choices, not easy ones, not clean ones, but choices. He could have aligned with his clan, supported the coup, allowed the conflict to unfold in its natural form, accepting whatever consequences followed. He could have refused entirely, stepped away from both sides, allowing events to develop without directly intervening. He could have attempted to expose the truth, to force the village and the clan into confrontation before the situation escalated into violence, risking instability in the hope that something might change. Each of these paths carried uncertainty. Each of them carried risk, and none of them guaranteed a better outcome. But they existed, and that existence matters, because it means that the path Itachi chose was not the only possible one, even if it was the one that appeared most controlled, most predictable, most aligned with preventing the immediate collapse of the village. This is where the question becomes more difficult, because it is not simply about whether there was another way. It is about whether that other way would have been better. And that is something that cannot be answered with certainty, because the alternative outcomes were never realized. They exist only as possibilities, as imagined scenarios that cannot be tested against reality. A civil war might have destroyed the village entirely. It might have drawn other nations into conflict, leading to a larger war with consequences far beyond what ultimately occurred. Or it might have resolved differently, with the Uchiha gaining influence without complete destruction, with a restructuring of the system that addressed the imbalance rather than eliminating it. There is no way to know. And that uncertainty is what makes the question so persistent. Because without a clear alternative, the decision remains suspended between justification and doubt, never fully settling into one or the other. It exists in a space where it can be understood, but not fully accepted, where it can be explained, but not completely resolved. This is the position that defines Itachi's choice, not as something that was unquestionably right, and not as something that was unquestionably wrong, but as something that was made within a limited set of options, under pressure, within a system that had already failed to prevent the situation from reaching that point. And within that framework, the idea of another way becomes something more abstract, something that belongs not to the moment of the decision, but to everything that came before it. Because by the time the choice had to be made, the system had already narrowed the possibilities to such an extent that any remaining path would carry consequences that could not be avoided. Which leads to a different version of the question. Not whether Itachi had another way, but whether the world itself did. Because if the system had functioned differently, if the tension had been addressed earlier, if the divide had been prevented before it became irreversible, then the situation that required such a decision might never have existed at all. And in that sense, the failure does not begin with the act. It begins with everything that made the act possible. The structures that allowed distrust to grow. The decisions that prioritized control over understanding. The silence that replaced communication. These are the things that removed the alternatives long before Itachi was forced to choose between them. And so, the question remains, not answered, not resolved, only present. Was there ever another way? Or was that possibility lost long before anyone realized it mattered? At the very end of everything, after every layer has been uncovered, after every assumption has been challenged, after the act, the silence, the lie, and the truth have all been placed side by side, there is still something that refuses to settle. It is not confusion, and it is not a lack of information. It is something quieter, heavier, something that exists even when everything is understood. It is the realization that understanding does not always lead to resolution, and that some questions remain not because they cannot be answered, but because every answer carries a cost that cannot be ignored. And at the center of that realization stands Itachi Uchiha, not as a symbol of clarity, but as a reflection of everything that makes this question so difficult to resolve. Was he right, or was he simply necessary? At first, the question feels like it should lead somewhere definitive, as if it invites a final judgment, a conclusion that brings everything together into a single, understandable outcome. But the more you examine it, the more it begins to resist that kind of closure, because being right implies something stable, something that can be measured against a consistent standard, something that exists outside of circumstance. And nothing about what happened exists outside of circumstance. Every part of it is tied to the conditions of the world, to the pressures that shaped the decision, to the consequences that extended far beyond the moment in which it was made. If being right means protecting innocent lives, then the act itself cannot be justified, because it required the destruction of those who had not yet acted, those who were part of a system that was moving toward conflict, but had not yet reached it. If being right means preventing a greater disaster, then the argument begins to shift, because the possibility of civil war, of external invasion, of a complete collapse of the village, introduces a scale of consequence that cannot be ignored. And if being right means upholding a moral principle that rejects the idea of sacrificing the few for the many, then the decision stands in direct opposition to that principle, regardless of its outcome. There is no version of right that resolves all of these contradictions at once. And that is why the question does not settle. Because every interpretation requires something to be accepted and something to be rejected. And no matter which direction you lean toward, something remains unresolved. If you choose to see Itachi as right, then you must accept the destruction of the Uchiha clan as a necessary outcome, something that could not be avoided without risking something worse. If you choose to see him as wrong, then you must accept that the alternative might have led to a scale of suffering that extends far beyond what actually occurred, something that could not be controlled once it began. And if you try to exist somewhere in between, acknowledging both the necessity and the cost, then the answer becomes something less satisfying, something that does not resolve the tension, but simply holds it in place. This is where the idea of necessity becomes more compelling and more unsettling at the same time, because necessity does not ask whether something is right. It asks whether it was required. It asks whether the situation left any other path that could achieve the same outcome without leading to something worse. It asks whether the system itself had already failed to the point where every remaining option carried a form of destruction, and whether the decision that was made was simply the one that limited that destruction in the most controlled way possible. And when you begin to look at Itachi's actions through that lens, the argument shifts again. Because if the situation truly reached a point where no peaceful resolution remained, If the coup was inevitable, if the response from the village would have escalated into a larger conflict, if the involvement of other nations would have turned that conflict into something far more devastating, then the decision begins to look less like a choice between right and wrong, and more like a choice between different forms of loss. And within that framework, the question is no longer about whether the act was justified in isolation, but whether the outcome it prevented carries enough weight to redefine how the act itself is understood. But even this perspective does not resolve everything, because necessity, by its nature, is tied to the system that creates it. And if something as extreme as this becomes necessary, then it raises a deeper question, one that extends beyond Itachi, beyond the massacre, beyond the immediate outcome. It raises the question of what kind of world produces situations where such decisions are required at all. Because a system that depends on hidden sacrifices, on actions that cannot be acknowledged, on individuals who must carry the weight of decisions that cannot be shared, is not a system that has found a stable or complete form of peace. It is a system that maintains itself through compromise, through imbalance, through the quiet acceptance that some outcomes cannot be avoided, only managed. And this is where Itachi's role becomes even more difficult to define, because he is not simply someone who made a decision. He is someone who absorbed the consequences of a system that could not resolve its own problems without creating them. He becomes the point where the system's failure is contained, the place where the cost is concentrated so that it does not spread further, the individual who carries something that would otherwise belong to everyone. And in doing so, he becomes something that does not fit into any clear category. Not a hero, because his actions cannot be separated from their cost. Not a villain, because his intentions cannot be separated from their purpose. But something else, something that exists between those definitions, something that reflects the reality of a world where decisions are not always clean, where outcomes are not always just, where survival does not always align with morality. This is why the question remains, because it cannot be resolved without simplifying something that should not be simplified. If you say he was right, you risk ignoring the weight of what was done. If you say he was wrong, you risk ignoring the consequences of what might have happened instead. If you say he was necessary, you accept that the world itself required something that should never have been required. And that acceptance carries its own kind of discomfort, its own kind of quiet unease that does not disappear simply because it makes the situation easier to understand. And perhaps that is where the answer, if it exists at all, begins to take shape. Not as a conclusion, but as an acceptance of complexity. Because Itachi's decision is not something that can be resolved into a single idea. It is something that must be held in tension, a recognition that he prevented something that could have been worse, while also creating something that should never have happened. A recognition that he preserved the village, while also destroying part of what made it worth preserving. A recognition that he acted when no one else would, while also becoming the reason that action was necessary in the first place. And within that tension, the question remains exactly where it began. Not answered, not settled, only present. Was he right? Or was he simply the one who was willing to become what the world required? And if that is the case, if someone must always exist to carry that burden, to make that decision, to accept that role when the system can no longer sustain itself without it, then the question does not end with Itachi. It extends beyond him, into the world that created him, into the system that needed him, into the idea of peace itself. Because a peace that requires someone like him is not a peace that is complete. It is a peace that is still unfinished, still dependent, still waiting for the next moment where someone will have to choose again.